In the summer of 1997, Miriam Holt stood on the edge of her family's land and watched a ghost rumble up the driveway. It was a long-haul truck, dust clinging to its flanks like a second skin, the diesel engine groaning a complaint against the steep Vermont grade. She was 24 years old, with a mind full of chemistry and hands calloused from a world that cared little for it. The farm around her was a tapestry of stubborn survival, its threads worn thin by 2 generations of relentless effort and receding hope. The air smelled of damp earth, cut hay, and the faint, sweet decay of windfall apples in the old orchard. It was a smell she knew better than her own name. The truck, trailing a flatbed trailer stacked impossibly high with wooden pallets, was an anomaly, a creature from a different, louder world. The driver, a man whose face was a road map of highways and cheap coffee, swung himself down from the cab. He didn't offer a greeting, just wiped his brow with the back of a greasy hand and squinted at the farmhouse, then at her. He held out a clipboard. "You Miriam Holt?" She nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "I am." "Got a delivery for you," he said, his voice gravelly. He gestured with his thumb toward the towering stacks on the trailer. "Sign here. And here." He pointed to 2 lines on a form dense with fine print. The top line was for receipt of goods. The bottom line was a liability waiver. Miriam had read a copy of it over the phone, her ear pressed to the receiver as a man named Henderson from the bottling plant laid out the terms in a voice devoid of emotion. It was a simple, brutal contract. They would give her the glass. All of it. In exchange, she would assume all risk and never, ever speak of its origin. It was a corporate secret being buried in a Vermont field. Let me tell you about the glass. It wasn't treasure. It was refuse. 14,000 glass jars, rejected from the production line of a regional bottling plant an hour south. They were imperfect soldiers, unfit for the gleaming, automated battlefields of commercial grocery. Some had a slight waviness to their sides, visible only when the light hit them just so. Others had a faint cloudiness, a ghost in the machine that made them unsuitable for premium branding. A few, a very few, had tiny air bubbles trapped within their walls, captured breaths from the furnace that had birthed them. To the company, they were a costly embarrassment, a disposal problem that would require permits and fees. To Miriam, they were something else entirely. She didn't know what, not yet. But she knew their value was not zero. She took the pen and signed her name, her signature a firm, declarative stroke against the flimsy paper. The driver grunted, took the clipboard, and climbed back into his cab. For the next 2 hours, the quiet of the farm was shattered by the hydraulic whine of a forklift he carried on the back of his truck. He unloaded pallet after pallet, creating a shimmering, fragile mountain next to the old dairy barn. It was a city of glass, catching the afternoon sun and throwing it back in 1,000 fractured pieces. When the last pallet was down, the driver gave a perfunctory wave, turned his rig around in the long-suffering grass, and rumbled back down the drive, leaving only a cloud of dust and the profound, ringing silence of his absence. Miriam stood before the pallets, all 14,000 jars of them. The sheer volume of it was terrifying. It was a physical manifestation of a promise she had made to herself, a promise so large it threatened to crush her. Her neighbors, the few who farmed the surrounding hills, would see this. They would talk. They already talked. They saw her as the girl who went away to college, filled her head with useless knowledge, and came back home to a farm that was slowly giving up the ghost. They saw her food science degree as a piece of paper that taught her things no one in this valley had ever needed to know. They saw her tending the overgrown orchard and the sprawling garden not as work but as a hobby, a way to pass the time before she finally gave up and moved to the city like everyone else's children. Now, they would see this mountain of glass, and they would laugh. She could almost hear it on the wind. She walked to the nearest pallet and ran her hand over the jars. They were cool to the touch. She picked one up. It was a standard pint jar, solid and heavy. She turned it in the light, found the flaw. A slight thickening near the base, a ripple that distorted the view through it. Useless for a high-speed labeling machine. Useless for a brand that demanded flawless uniformity. But the seal was good. The threads were clean. It would hold. It would preserve. It was honest, if not perfect. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen, the heart of the old farmhouse, and opened the books. They weren't textbooks full of chemical formulas and pasteurization temperatures. They were her mother's recipe books. 2 of them, bound in worn floral cloth, their pages softened and stained by years of use. Her mother had been gone for 5 years, taken by an illness that had moved with the quiet efficiency of a frost settling on the fields. What she had left behind was this house, this land, and this wisdom captured in elegant, looping cursive. Now, let me explain something about these books. They were more than just lists of ingredients. Her mother had been a different kind of scientist, one who worked by feel and instinct, by the memory of seasons and the subtle language of the land. Beside a recipe for spiced apple butter, a note read, "Use the Jonagolds from the west side of the orchard. They get the late sun, makes them sweeter. Don't rush the simmer. The flavor needs time to deepen, like a good conversation." Next to her instructions for wild blackberry jam, a scrawled addendum, a spoonful of whiskey at the end, for warmth and for courage. These books were a philosophy. They spoke of patience. They insisted on honesty. They taught that the best ingredients were not the most perfect looking, but the ones most true to their nature. A gnarled apple, a slightly bruised peach, these held character. Her mother had understood the soul of food. Miriam turned the pages, the scent of old paper and vanilla rising from them. She read about the science of pectin, the magic of sugar and acid, the sacred pact of preservation that allowed one to capture the essence of a perfect summer day and hold it for the dead of winter. And as she read her mother's words, she understood what her own education had given her. Her degree wasn't a rejection of this world. It was a lens through which to understand it more deeply. She knew the precise temperature at which pectin sets. She understood the role of pH in preventing botulism. She could calculate yield and density and water activity with an accuracy that would have astonished her mother. Her mother had the art. Miriam now had the science to make that art repeatable, scalable, and safe. The 2 forms of knowledge, the ancestral and the academic, did not conflict. They braided together into something new, something strong. The secret wasn't just the recipes. The secret was the synthesis. It was the fusion of her mother's handwritten wisdom with the cold, hard facts of a textbook. It was the respect for the old ways, fortified by an understanding of the new. And those 14,000 jars? They weren't a burden. They were the vessel. They were the beginning. The first step was to move the glass. For a week, she worked from sunup to sundown, using a handcart to move the jars, box by box, into the cool, dark space of the old dairy barn. The work was punishing, her muscles screaming in protest. But with each trip, the mountain outside shrank, and the city of glass was rebuilt inside, safe from the elements and the prying eyes of her neighbors. She organized them by flaw, creating sections for the wavy ones, the cloudy ones, the ones with the tiny bubbles. She was taking inventory of her flawed, beautiful army. Then, she went to see a man named Arthur Sterling. He was the county extension officer, a man whose job it was to help farmers innovate and survive. His office was in the county seat, a small, sterile room that smelled of stale paper and institutional coffee. Mr. Sterling was a man who seemed to have been born middle-aged, with a soft paunch and a tie that was always slightly askew. He believed in government pamphlets, soil reports, and the established way of doing things. Miriam sat across from his metal desk and laid out her plan. She spoke of the orchard, the berry patches, the sprawling vegetable garden. She spoke of value-added products. She explained her intention to create a line of high-quality preserves, jams, and pickles. She told him about her unique access to containers, though she was careful not to mention their origin, honoring her vow of silence. She simply called it a bulk acquisition. Mr. Sterling listened with a placid, vaguely patronizing smile. He steepled his fingers and looked at her over the top of his glasses. When she was finished, he leaned back in his squeaking chair. "Well, Miss Holt," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "that sounds like a fine hobby. A good way to keep busy." He picked up a pamphlet on crop rotation. "But the numbers on a business like that, they don't work. The margins are too thin. The market is saturated. You'd be better off leasing your orchard to the cider collective." A fine hobby. The words landed like stones. Miriam felt a cold, quiet anger rise within her. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him, her gaze level and unwavering. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small ledger book and a pen. She opened it to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote the date. Then, she wrote his words down, verbatim. A fine hobby. Margins too thin. Market saturated. Mr. Sterling watched her write, a flicker of confusion on his face. "What are you doing?" "Just taking notes," she said, her voice calm. She closed the ledger, stood up, and extended a hand. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Sterling." He shook her hand, looking unsettled. She walked out of his office, the anger now transmuted into fuel. A hobby. He was wrong, and she would spend the next 10 years proving it. The subsequent 2 decades were a masterclass in patience, a long, slow hymn to the virtue of incremental progress. The first year was the hardest. She started with what was abundant, the apples from the neglected orchard. She made her mother's spiced apple butter, the scent filling the farmhouse for days, a sweet, cinnamon ghost in every room. She filled 300 of the wavy jars, her new scientific knowledge ensuring every single one was perfect inside, regardless of the vessel's slight imperfection. She designed a simple, elegant label herself and printed it at the town library. It read, "Holt Homestead Provisions." Honest fruit. Patiently made. Her first sales floor was a card table at the Saturday farmers market. She stood behind her small gleaming array of jars while other vendors sold mountains of corn and tomatoes. People were hesitant at first. They saw the simple label, the slightly odd-looking jars. But then she opened a sample. She offered a taste of the apple butter on a small cracker. The first woman who tried it, an old-timer named Eleanor, closed her eyes. A slow smile spread across her face. "My heavens," she whispered. "That tastes like my grandmother's kitchen." She bought 4 jars. That was the beginning. Word of mouth is a slow but powerful force in a place like Vermont. Every week, more people came to her table. They came for the apple butter, then for the wild blackberry jam with the spoonful of whiskey, then for the bread and butter pickles made from her grandfather's recipe. They didn't care that the jars had tiny flaws. They cared that the product inside was flawless. It was real. In a world of high fructose corn syrup and artificial flavors, what Miriam was selling was honesty in a jar. At the end of that first year, she had sold through 3,000 jars and cleared a profit of just over $8,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it wasn't a hobby either. It was a start. The whispers in the community began to change. The laughter faded, replaced by a grudging curiosity. They saw her truck, An old but reliable Ford, loaded with boxes heading to specialty food shops in Burlington and Stowe. She had driven there herself, a case of her best products on the passenger seat, and convinced the owners to take a chance on her. She didn't have a marketing budget or a sales team. She had a superior product and a quiet, unshakable belief in its worth. The shops sold out. They ordered more. There were moments of private doubt. Of course there were. One autumn evening, in the third year, a batch of pear preserves refused to set. 100 jars of syrupy, useless fruit. It represented a week of labor and a significant loss of income. She sat alone in the vast barn, surrounded by the remaining 10,000 jars, the silence pressing in on her. The sheer scale of her ambition felt absurd. The weight of the farm, of her family's legacy, settled on her shoulders. She was tired, so deeply tired. She thought of Mr. Sterling's words. A fine hobby. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was all a foolish girl's dream. She walked back to the house, ready to concede defeat. On the kitchen table, her mother's recipe book was open. Her eyes fell on a note scrawled in the margin of a page on canning tomatoes. Sometimes, the land will test you. It wants to know if you are worthy of its gifts. Be patient. Be stubborn. The harvest always comes to those who wait. Reading those words felt like her mother was in the room, a hand on her shoulder. Miriam took a deep breath. She went back to the barn, dumped the failed batch into buckets for the neighbors' pigs, and started over the next morning before the sun was up. The harvest always comes to those who wait. The turning point arrived in the 5th year, delivered by the mailman. It came in the form of a glossy food magazine. A freelance writer, passing through Vermont on an assignment, had bought a jar of her pickled asparagus at a small general store. He had been so impressed that he tracked her down. They had spoken on the phone for an hour, and she had told him her story, carefully omitting the origin of the jars but speaking at length about her mother's philosophy and her own scientific approach. She had forgotten all about it until the magazine arrived. There, on page 72, was a short but glowing article titled "The Scientist of Sustenance." It praised her products as a perfect blend of tradition and precision. The world cracked open. The phone began to ring that afternoon and did not stop for a week. Orders came from California, from Texas, from Florida. People wanted a taste of something real, and the article had told them where to find it. Suddenly, Miriam was facing a logistical nightmare. She had the product, she had the jars, but she had no system for mass shipping. She hired 2 women from town to help her pack boxes. The post office in their small village had never seen so much activity. For 2 months, her life was a blur of packing tape, shipping labels, and exhaustion. But when the dust settled, she had fulfilled every single order. The city of glass in her barn was now visibly diminished. Her bank account was not. This new level of success attracted a different kind of attention. A year later, a man in a crisp suit drove a European sedan up her now paved driveway. He represented a large regional grocery chain. He wanted to put Holt Homestead provisions in all 62 of his stores. He toured her facility now, a clean, professional kitchen she had built in the renovated barn, and was impressed. He sat with her in the farmhouse kitchen, the same room where she had doubted everything, and made his offer. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Have you ever poured your soul into your work, only to have someone with a spreadsheet tell you what it's worth? The buyer named his price. It was a per-unit cost that, when multiplied by the volume he wanted, represented a staggering amount of money. But the number was too low. It would force her to cut corners, to rush the process, to compromise the very principles her brand was built on. It would turn her art into a commodity. He expected her to be grateful, to be overwhelmed by the scale of the opportunity. He saw a small-time farm girl he could easily intimidate. He did not see the woman who had faced down 14,000 jars and the condescension of an entire county. Miriam listened patiently. When he was done, she slid a single sheet of paper across the table. On it were her numbers, her cost of goods, her labor, her overhead, and her margin. A margin that was fair, but not greedy. "This is my price," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I know it's higher than you're used to. It's because I still pick the fruit by hand. I still simmer the apple butter for 8 hours. I will not use pectin from a box when I can get it from the apples themselves. My price is the cost of not compromising. Take it or leave it." The buyer was stunned into silence. He looked at her, then at the paper. He saw no fear in her eyes, no desperation. He saw a woman who knew the value of her work to the penny. He saw the quiet confidence of a master. He picked up the sheet of paper. "All right, Miss Holt," he said, a slow smile of respect spreading across his face. "You've got a deal." That contract took her business to a new level. Revenue doubled, then tripled. She hired more people, offering good wages and a share in the profits. The Holt farm, once a symbol of quiet decay, was now a hub of vibrant, purposeful activity. The land itself seemed to respond, the orchard yielding more fruit, the gardens producing richer vegetables. The land remembered. A few weeks after the grocery chain deal was announced in the local paper, another car came up the driveway. It was an old, American-made sedan, and out of it stepped Arthur Sterling. He looked older, his shoulders slumped a little. He had his hat in his hands. He walked up to Miriam, who was overseeing a shipment leaving the barn. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Miriam," he started, and then stopped. He looked at the bustling barn, at the pallets of finished goods, at the quiet confidence she wore like a second skin. "I came to say I was wrong." The words hung in the air between them. It was the acknowledgement she had worked a decade for, and now that it was here, she felt no flush of victory, no desire to gloat. There was only a quiet sense of completion. "You built something real here," he continued, his voice full of a weary sincerity. "Something important. I didn't see it. I'd be honored if you would consider speaking at the annual county agricultural meeting. The farmers around here, they need to hear your story. They need to hear how you did it." She looked at the man who had called her dream a hobby, and she thought of the ledger, still tucked away in her desk, with his words written on the first page. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," she said. "I'd be happy to." By the 10th year, in 2007, Holt Homestead Provisions crossed $500,000 in annual revenue. The farm was debt-free. The house was restored. One afternoon, Miriam found herself packing an order of her signature spiced apple butter. She reached for a jar and realized it was the last one. The very last of the original 14,000. It had a beautiful, pronounced wave in its side, a flaw as unique as a fingerprint. She held it up to the light, this imperfect vessel that had contained her entire future. It had started here, with a mountain of rejected glass and a quiet promise. She thought of her mother's hands, covered in flour. She thought of Mr. Sterling's dismissive smile. She thought of the first dollar she ever earned at the farmer's market. All of it was in this jar. She didn't ship it. She took it to the kitchen, filled it with wildflowers from the field, and placed it on the windowsill, right next to her mother's recipe books. The establishment saw 14,000 problems, a liability to be disposed of in silence. But a young woman with her mother's wisdom in her hands and science in her head saw 14,000 opportunities. They called it a hobby. She built an enterprise. They offered her volume. She chose her value. Because the land, the recipes, and the quiet, stubborn work had taught her a fundamental truth. The vessel may be flawed, but what matters is the honesty of what you put inside.